Take me through the saga of university presidents testifying on this topic, on the topic of protests on college campuses, protests that call for the genocide of Jewish people, and the university presidents. Maybe you could describe it more precisely, but they fail to denounce the calls for genocide.
So it begins on October 8th, probably. And, you can do a compare and contrast with how Dartmouth managed the events of October 7th and the aftermath, and how Harvard did. And on October 8th, or shortly thereafter, the Dartmouth president, who had been in her job for precisely the same number of months that the Harvard president had been in her job, the first thing she did is she got the most important professors of Middle East studies who were Arab and who were Jews, and they convened them and held an open session, Q&A, for students to talk about what's going on in the Middle East, and began an opportunity for common understanding among the student body. And Dartmouth has been a relatively benign environment on this issue, and students are able to do work, and there aren't disruptive protests with people with bullhorns walking into classrooms, interfering with, people pay today $82,000 a year, which itself is crazy, to go to Harvard. But imagine your family borrows the money, or you borrow the money as a student, and your learning is disrupted by constant protests, and the university does nothing. When George Floyd died, the Harvard president wrote a very strong letter denouncing what had taken place, and, calling this an important moment in American history, and took it incredibly seriously. Her first letter about October 7th was not that. Let's put it that way. And then her second letter was not that. And then ultimately, she was sort of forced by the board or the pressure to make a more public statement. But it was clear that it was hard for her to come to an understanding of this terrorist act. And then the protests erupted on campus, and they started out reasonably benign. And then the protesters got more and more aggressive in terms of violating university rules on things like bullying, and the university did nothing. And that obviously, for the Jewish students, the Israeli faculty, Jewish faculty, created an incredibly uncomfortable environment. And the president seemed indifferent. And, I went up to campus and I met with hundreds of students in small groups and larger groups. And they're like, Bill, why is the president doing nothing? Why is the administration doing nothing? And that was really the beginning. And that, I reached out to the president, reached out to the board of Harvard. I said, look, this thing is heading in the wrong direction, and you need to fix it. And I have some ideas, love to share. And I got the Heisman, as they say. They just kept pushing off the opportunity for me to meet with the president and meet with the board. And at a certain point in time, I pushed. I'm kind of a activist when you push me. It reminded me of, like early days of activism, where I couldn't get the CEO of Wendy's to return my call. I couldn't get the CEO of Harvard, to take a meeting. And then finally, I spoke to the chairman of the board, a woman by the name of Penny Pritzker, who I, knew from on a business school board with her. And it was, as I described, one of the more disappointing conversations of my life. And it did not seem, she seemed a bit like, if you will, deer in the headlights. They couldn't do this, they couldn't do that. The law was preventing them from doing various things. And that led to my first letter to the university. And I sort of ended the letter, sort of giving this president of Harvard a dare to be great speech. This is your opportunity. You can fix this. This could be your legacy. And I sent it I emailed it to the president and the board members whose email addresses I had. I posted it on Twitter. And I got no response, no acknowledgement, nothing. And in fact, the open dialogue I had with a couple of people on the board basically got shut down after that. And that led to letter number 2. And then when the Congress, led by Lee Stefanik, announced an investigation of anti-Semitism on campus and concern about violations of law, the president was called to testify along with two other, the president of MIT, the president of University of Pennsylvania, who were having similar issues on campus. I reached out to the president of Harvard and said, well, one, the Israeli government had gotten in touch and offered the opportunity for me to see the Hamas, if you will, GoPro film. And I said, what, I'd love to show it at Harvard. And they thought that would be a great idea. And so I partnered with the head of Harvard Chabad, a guy named Rabbi Hershey. And we were putting the film up on campus. And I thought, if the president were to see this, it would give her a lot of perspective on what happened. And she should see it before her testimony. And so I reached out to her, or actually Rabbi Hershey did. And he was told she would be out of town and couldn't see it. And then I reached out to her again, said, look, I'll facilitate your attendance in the Congress, come see the film, I'll fly you down. That was rejected. And then she testified. And I watched, a good percentage, 80% of the testimony of all three presidents. And it was an embarrassment to the country, embarrassment to the universities. They were evasive. They didn't answer questions. They were rude. They smirked. They looked, very disrespectful to our Congress. And then, of course, there was that several minutes where finally, at least Stefanik was not getting answers to her questions. And she said, let me be, kind of clear. What if protesters are calling for genocide for the Jews? Does that violate your rules on bullying and harassment? And the three of them basically gave the same answer. It depends on the context. And not until they actually executed on the genocide does the university have the right to intervene. And the thing that perhaps bothered me the most was the incredible hypocrisy. Harvard was, each of these universities are ranked by this entity called FIRE, which is a nonprofit that focuses on free speech on campus. And Harvard it's been in the bottom quartile for the last 5 years and dropped to last before October 7th out of like 250.
I should mention briefly that I've interviewed on this podcast the founder of FIRE and the current head of FIRE. We discussed this at length, including running for the board of Harvard and the whole procedure of all that. It's quite a fascinating investigation of free speech. For people who care about free speech absolutism, that's a good episode to listen to, because those folks kind of fight for this idea. It's a difficult idea actually to internalize. What does free speech in college campuses look like?
Harvard has become a place where free speech is not tolerated on campus, or at least free speech that's not part of the accepted dialogue, or this whole notion of speech codes and microaggressions really emerged on the elite, the Harvard, Yale campuses of the world. And, the president of Harvard's, then president of Harvard's explanation for why, you could call for the genocide of the Jewish people on campus was Harvard's commitment to free expression. And, one of the more hypocritical statements of all time. And you really can't have it both ways. Either Harvard has to be a place where it's a free speech. She basically said we're a free speech absolutist place, which is why we have to allow this. And Harvard could not be further from that. And so that was a big part of it. And I was in the barber chair, if you will, getting a haircut. And I had a guy on my team send me the 3-minute section. I said, cut that line of questioning. And I put out a little tweet on that. And I call it my greatest hits of posts. It's got something like 110 million views. And everyone looked at this and said, what is wrong with, university campuses? And their leadership and their governance, by the way. In a way, this whole conversation has been about governance. Harvard has a disastrous governance structure, which is why we have the problem we have.
And just to linger on the testimony, you mentioned, smirks and this kind of stuff, and you mentioned dare to be great. I myself am kind of a sucker for great leadership. And those moments, you mentioned Churchill or so on, even great speeches. People talk down on speeches like it's maybe just words, but I think speeches can define a culture and define a place, define a people. They can inspire. And I think actually the testimony before Congress could have been an opportunity to redefine what Harvard is. Dare to be great, dare to be a great leader.
The president of Harvard had a huge opportunity because she went third. right? The first two gave the world's most disastrous answers to the question. And she literally just copied their answer, which is itself, kind of ironic in light of ultimately what happened.
It's tough because you can get busy as a president, as a leader, and so on. There's these meetings, and so you think Congress, maybe you're smirking at the ridiculousness of the meeting. You need to remember that many of these are opportunities to give a speech of a lifetime.
Sure.
Like that, if there's principles which you want to see an institution become and embody in the next several decades, there's opportunities to do that. And you, as a great leader, also need to have a sense of when is the opportunity to do that. And October 7th really woke up the world on all sides, honestly. Like there is serious issue going on here. And then the protests woke up the university. There's a serious issue going on here. It's an opportunity to speak on free speech and on genocide, both.
Yes.
Do you see the criticism that you are a billionaire donor and you sort of used your power and financial influence unfairly to affect the governing structure of Harvard in this case?
First of all, I never threatened to use financial or other resources. The only thing I did here was I wrote public letters. I spoke privately to a couple members of the board. I spoke for 45 minutes to the chairman. None of those conversations were effective or went anywhere as far as I could tell. I think my public letters and then some of the posts I did,
Tweets, yeah,
and that that little 3-minute video excerpt had an impact. But it wasn't about. I mean, you can criticize me for being a billionaire, but that had, it was really the words. It's a bit like, again, going back to the corporate analogy. It's not the fact that you own 5% of the company that causes people to vote in your favor. It's the fact that your ideas are right. And I think, I was disappointed after the congressional testimony. The board of Harvard said that they were 100% behind, unanimously 100% behind President Gay. And so clearly I was ineffective. And ultimately what took her down was other, I would say, activists who identified issues with academic integrity. And then she lost the confidence of the faculty. And once that happens, it's hard to stay. And I wanted her to be fired, basically, or be forced to resign because of failures of leadership, because that would have sent a message about the importance of leadership. Failure to stop a emergence of anti-Semitism on campus. And, there's some news today. The protests are getting worse.
Is there some tension between free speech on college campuses and disciplining students for calls of genocide?
Yes, there's certainly a tension. And I think, first of all, I think free speech is incredibly important. And I'm on the side, I'm a lot closer to absolutism on free speech than otherwise. The issue I had was the hypocrisy, right? They were restricting other kinds of speech on campus, principally conservative speech, conservative views. So it wasn't a free speech absolutist campus. And the protests were actually quite threatening to students. And there are limits to even absolutist free speech. And they begin where people feel, intimidation, harassment, and, threat to bodily harm, et cetera. That kind of speech is generally, and again, it's pretty technical, but as people feel like they're in imminent harm by virtue of the protest, that speech is at risk of not meeting the standards for free speech. But Harvard is a private corporation. And as a private corporation, they can put on what restrictions they want. And Harvard had introduced only a few months before bullying and harassment policies. And that's why Representative Stefanik focused on, it's not like she said, does calling for genocide against the Jews violate your free speech policies? She says, does calling for genocide against the Jews violate your policies on bullying and harassment? And I think everyone looked at this when they said, it depends on the context. And they said, look, if you replace Jews with some other ethnic group, students who've used the N-word, for example, have been thrown off campus or suspended. Students who've, hate speech directed at LGBTQ people has led to disciplinary action. But, attacking, spitting on Jewish students or, kind of roughing them up a bit seemed like, or calling for their elimination didn't seem to violate the policies. So it's, look, I think a university should be a place where you have broad views and open viewpoints and broad discussion. But but it should also be a place where students don't feel threatened going to class, where their learning is not interrupted, when final exams are not interrupted by people coming in and with loud protest. Students asked me when I went up there, what would you do if you were Harvard president? I said, and this was before I knew what was happening on the Dartmouth campus. I said, I'd convene everyone together. This is Harvard. We have access to the best minds in the world. Let's have a better understanding of the history. Let's understand the backdrop. Let's focus on solutions. Let's bring Arab and Jewish and Israeli students together. Let's form groups to create communication. That's how you solve this kind of problem. And none of that stuff has been done. It's not that hard.
Do you think this reveals a deeper problem in terms of ideology in the governance of Harvard, in maybe the culture of Harvard?
Yes. So on governance, the governance structure is a disaster. So the way it works today is Harvard has two principal boards. There's the board of the corporation, the so-called fellows of Harvard. It's a board of, 12 independent directors and the president. There's no shareholder vote. There's no proxy system. It's really a self-perpetuating board that effectively elects its own members. So there's, once the balance tips politically one way or another, it can be kept that way forever. There's no kind of rebalancing system. If a U.S. corporation goes off the rails, so to speak, the shareholders can get together and vote off the directors. There's no ability to vote off the directors. Then there's the board of overseers, which is, I think, 32 directors. And there, a few years ago, if you could put together 600 signatures, you could run for that board and put up a bunch of candidates, and about 5 or 6 get elected each year. And a group did exactly that, and it was an oil and gas kind of disinvestment group. They got the signatures, a couple of them got elected, and Harvard then changed the rules. And they said, now we need 3,200 signatures. And by the way, if there are these dissident directors on the board, we're going to cap them at 5. So if 3 were elected in the oil and gas thing, now there are only 2 seats available. Mm-hmm. And then a group of former students, kind of younger alums, one of whom I knew, approached me and said, look, Bill, we should run for the board. And they decided this pretty late, only a few weeks before the signatures were due, and love your support. I took a look at their platform. I thought it looked great. I said, look, happy to support. And I posted about them, did a Zoom with them, and they got thousands of signatures. Collectively, the 4 got 12,000 signatures or something like this. And they missed by about 10% the threshold. And what did Harvard do in the middle of the election? They made it very, very difficult to sign up, for a vote. And it just makes them look terrible. And they've got now thousands of alums upset that, and again, this wasn't an election. This was just to put the names on the slate. So the only candidates on the slate are the ones selected by the existing members. And so it's businesses fail because of governance failures. Universities fail because of governance failures. It's not really the president's fault, because the job of the board is to hire and fire the president and help guide the institution academically and otherwise. So that's governance. On ideology, I was like, how can this be? October 7th, the event that woke me up was 30 student organizations came out with a public letter on October 8th, literally the morning after this letter was created, and said, Israel is solely responsible for Hamas's violent acts. Again, Israel had not even mounted a defense at this point, and there were still terrorists running around in the southern part of Israel. And I'm like, Harvard students, 34 Harvard student organizations signed this letter. And I'm like, what is going on? WTF, right? And that's when I went up on campus and I started talking to the faculty. And that's when I started hearing about, actually, Bill, it's this DEI ideology. I'm like, what? DEI, like diversity, equity, inclusion. Obviously I'm familiar with these words, and I see this in the corporate context. And they say, yeah. And they started talking to me about this oppressed framework, which is effectively taught on campus and represents the backdrop for many of the courses that are offered and the various some of the studies and other degree offerings. I'm like, I had not even heard of this, and I'm a pretty aware person, but I was completely unaware. And basically, they're like, look, Israel is deemed an oppressor, and the Palestinians are deemed the oppressed. And you take the side of the the oppressed and any acts of the oppressed to dislodge the oppressor, regardless of how vile or barbaric, are okay. I'm like, okay, this is a super dangerous ideology. And so I wrote a questioning post about this. I'm like, here's what I'm hearing. Is this right? And then I had a friend of mine sent me Christopher Rufo's book, America's Cultural Revolution, which is sort of a sociological study of the origins of the DEI movement and critical race theory. And I found it actually one of the more important books I've read. And also I found it quite concerning. And really, it's sort of ultimately DEI comes out of a kind of a Marxist, socialist backdrop way to look at the world. And so I think there are a lot of issues with it, but unfortunately it's advancing, I ultimately concluded, racism as opposed to fighting it, which is what I thought it was ultimately about.
So maybe you can speak to that book a little bit. So there's a history that traces back across decades and then that infiltrated college campuses.
So basically what Rufo argues is that the Black Power movement of the 60s really failed. It was a very violent movement, and many of the protagonists ended up in jail. And out of that movement, a number of kind of thought leaders, this guy named Marcuse and others, built this framework, kind of an approach. He said, look, if we're going to be successful, can't be a violent movement, number one. And number two, we need to infiltrate, if you will, the universities. And we need to become part of the faculty. And we need to teach the students. And then once we take over the universities with this ideology, then we can go into government, and then we can go into corporations, and we can change the world. So I thought important book. And the more I dug in, the more I felt there was credibility to this, not just the kind of sociological backdrop, but to what it meant on campus. And Harvard faculty were telling me that, there's really is no such thing as free speech on campus. And that, there was a survey done, I don't know, a year or so ago, the Harvard faculty, and only 2% of the faculty admitted, even in an anonymous survey, admitted to having a conservative point of view. So we have a campus that's 98% non-conservative, liberal, progressive, that's adopted this DEI construct. And then I learned from a member of the search committee for the Harvard president that they were restricted in looking at candidates, only those who met the DEI office's criteria. And I shared this in one of my postings, and I was accused of being a racist. And that's someone who believes in that diversity is a very good thing for organizations, and that equity, fairness is really important, and having an inclusive culture is critical, for a functioning of organization. So here I was, someone who was like, okay, DEI sounds good to me, at least in the small d, small e, I version of events, but this DEI ideology is really problematic.
So what's the way to fix this in the next few years? The infiltration of DEI with the uppercase version of universities and the things that have troubled you, the things you saw at Harvard and elsewhere.
In the same way, this was an eye-opening event for me. It has been for a very broad range of other people. I've never gotten, I mentioned General Growth. I got a lot of nice letters from people for making money on a stock that went up 100 times. But I literally get hundreds of emails, letters, texts, handwritten letters, typed letters from people from the ages of 25 to 85 saying, Bill, this is so important. Thanks for speaking out on this. You were saying what, so many of us believe but have been afraid to say. I described it as almost a McCarthy-esque kind of movement, and that if you challenge the DEI construct, people accuse you of being a racist. It's happened to me already. I'm perhaps, I'm much less vulnerable than a university professor who can get shouted off campus, canceled. I'm sort of difficult to cancel, but that doesn't mean people are going to try. And I've been the victim of a couple of interesting articles in the last few days, or at least one in particular in the Washington Post, written by what I thought was a well-meaning reporter. But it's just clear that I've taken on some big parts of at least the progressive establishment. DEI, I'm also a believer that Biden should have stepped aside a long time ago, and it's only getting worse. So I'm attacking the president, DEI, elite universities, and you make some enemies doing that.
But I should say I'm still at MIT, and I love MIT, and I believe in the power of great universities to explore ideas, to inspire young people to think, to inspire young people to lead.
Let me ask, okay, how can you explore how to think when you're only shared a certain point of view, right? How can you learn about leadership when the governance and leadership of the institution is broken, and exposure to ideas, if you're limited in the ideas that you're exposed to? So I think universities are at risk. I mean, the concerning thing, right, is if 34 student organizations that each have, 30 members or maybe more, right, that's 1,000. Okay, that's a meaningful percentage of the campus, perhaps, that ultimately respond. Now, 10 or so of the 30 withdrew the statement once many of the members realized what they had written. So I don't think it seems like the statement was signed by the leadership and not necessarily supported by all the various students that were members. But if the university teaches people these precepts, this is the next generation of leaders. Normally, if you think about, I wrote my college thesis on university admissions. The reason why controlling, the gates of the Harvard institution, the admissions office is important, isn't that many of these people who graduate end up with, the top jobs in government, and ultimately become judges. They're permeate through society, and so it really matters what they learn. And if they're limited to one side of the political aisle, and they're not open to a broad array of views, and these represent some of the most elite institutions in our country, I think it's very problematic for the country long term.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I also felt like the leadership wasn't even part of the problem as much as they were almost out of touch, like unaware that this is an important moment, it's an important crisis, it's an important opportunity to step up as a leader and define the future of an institution. So I don't even know where the source of the problem is. It could be literally governance structure, as we've been
Well, it's two
talking
things.
about.
I think it's governance structure. I also think universities are they're not selecting leaders.
Yeah.
It's not clear to me that universities should necessarily be run by academics, right? The dean of a university, the person who helps, there's sort of the business of the university, right? And then there's the academics of the university, and having I would argue having a business leader run these institutions, and then having a board that's involved, a board that has itself diverse viewpoints, and by the way, permanently structured to have diverse viewpoints, is a much better way to run a university than picking an academic that the faculty supports. Because, one of the things I learned about how faculty get hired at universities, ultimately it's signed off by the board, but, the new faculty are chosen by each of the various departments. And once the departments tip, there's sort of a tipping point politically where once they tip in one direction, the faculty recruit more people like themselves. And so the departments become more and more progressive, if you will, with the passage of time, and they only advance candidates that match that meet their political objectives. It's not a great way to build an institution which allows for
small d diversity.
Allows for diversity. And diversity, by the way, is not just race and gender. And that's also something I feel very strongly about.
Well, luckily, engineering, robotics is touched last by this. It is touched, but when I'm at the computing building, Stata and the new one, politics doesn't infiltrate, or I haven't seen it infiltrate quite as deeply as elsewhere. But
it's in the biology department at Harvard, because biology is controversial now.
Yes.
Because biology and gender, there are faculty. There's a woman at Harvard who was literally canceled from the faculty as a member, I think she was of the med school. And she was, she made the argument that there are basically, two genders determined by biology. She wasn't allowed to stay.
Oh,
that's another topic for another time.
That's another topic.
You should do a show on that one. That'd be an interesting one.
So as you said, technically Claudine Gay, the president of Harvard, resigned over plagiarism, not over the thing that you were initially troubled by.
It's hard to really know, right? It's not like a provable fact. I would say at a certain point in time, she lost the confidence of the faculty, and that was ultimately the catalyst. And whether that was, how much of that was the plagiarism issue and how much of that was some of the things that preceded it, or was it all of these issues in their entirety? There's no way to do a calculus.
Can you explain the nature of this plagiarism from what you remember?
So Aaron Sabarium and Christopher Rufo, one from the Free Beacon, and Chris, surfaced some allegations on or identified some plagiarism issues that I would say the initial examples were, use of the same words with proper attribution, some missing footnotes. And then over time, with, I guess, more digging, they released, I think, ultimately something like 76 examples of what they called plagiarism in, I think, 8 of 11 of her articles. And one of the other things that came forth here is, as president of the university, she had sort of the thinnest transcript academically of any previous president, very small, relatively small body of work. And then when you couple that with the amount of plagiarism that was pervasive, and then I guess some of the other examples that surfaced were not missing quotation marks, where the authors of the work felt that their ideas had been stolen. And really, plagiarism is academic fraud. There are indicia. One indicia of plagiarism is a missing footnote. That could also be a clerical error. And so when a professor is accused of plagiarism, the university does sort of a deep dive. They have these administrative boards, and it can take 6 months, 9 months, a year to evaluate, intent matters. Was this intentional theft of another person's idea? That's academic fraud. Or was this sloppy, you missed, or just humanity, right? You miss a footnote here or there. And I think once it got to a place where people felt it was theft of someone else's intellectual property, that's when it became intolerable for her to stay as president of Harvard.
So is there a spectrum for you between different kinds of plagiarism, maybe plagiarizing words and plagiarizing ideas and plagiarizing novel ideas?
Of course. The common understanding of plagiarism, if you look in the dictionary, it's about theft. Theft requires an intent. Did the person intentionally take someone else's ideas or words? Now, if you're writing a novel, right, words matter more, right? If you're taking Shakespeare and presenting it as your own words, if you're, writing about ideas, ideas matter, but you're not supposed to take someone else's words without properly acknowledging them, whether it's quotation marks or otherwise. But in the context of a academic's life's work before AI, everyone's going to have missing quotation marks and footnotes. I remember writing my own thesis. I would take, there were books you couldn't take out of Widener Library, so I'd have index cards, and I'd write stuff on index cards, and I put a little citation to make sure I remembered to cite it properly. And scrambling to do your thesis, get it in on time. What's the chances you forget at what point what are your words versus the author's words, and you forget to put quotation marks? Just the humanity, the human fallibility of it. So, you don't get, it's not academic fraud to have human fallibility, but it's academic fraud if you take someone else's ideas that are an integral part of your work.
Is there a part of you that regrets that, at least from the perception of it, the president of Harvard stepped down over plagiarism versus over refusing to say that the calls for genocide are wrong?
Again, I think it would have sent a better message if a leader fails as a leader, and that's the reason for their resignation or dismissal, then she gets, if you will, caught on a technical violation that had nothing to do with failed leadership. Because I don't know what lesson that what's the lesson that teaches the board about selecting the next candidate? I mean, the future of Harvard, a lot of it's going to depend on who they pick as the next leader. Here's an interesting anecdote that I think is not surfaced publicly. So a guy named Larry Bacco was the previous president of Harvard. Larry Bacco was on the search committee, and they were looking for a new president. And what was strange was they picked an old white guy to be president of Harvard when there was, a call for a more diverse president. And what I learned was Harvard actually ran a process, had a diverse new president of Harvard. And in the due diligence on that candidate shortly before the announcement of the new president, they found out that that presidential candidate had a plagiarism problem. And the search had gone on long enough, they couldn't restart a search to find another candidate. So they picked Larry Bacco off the board, off the search committee, to be the next president of Harvard as kind of an interim solution. And then there was that much more pressure to have a more diverse candidate this time around, because it was a big disappointment to the DEI office, if you will, and I would say to the community at large. That Harvard, of all places, couldn't have a racially diverse president. It would send an important message. So the strange thing is that they didn't do due diligence on President Gay, and that it was a relatively quick process. So the whole thing, I think, is worthy of further, exploration.
So this goes deeper than just the president.
Yes, for sure. When a company fails, most people blame the CEO. I generally blame the board, right? Because the board's job is to make sure the right person's running the company, and if they're failing, help the person. If they can't help the person, make a change. That's not what's happened here. The board's hand was sort of forced from the outside, whereas they should have made their own decision from the inside.
You still love Harvard?
Sure. It's a 400-odd year institution. It enormously helpful to me in my life, I'm sure. My sister also went to Harvard, and the experiences, learnings, friendships, relationships. Again, I'm very happy with my life. Harvard was an important part of my life. I went there for both undergrad and business school. I learned a ton, met a lot of faculty, a number of my closest friends who I still really keep in touch with. I made then. So yeah, it's a great place, but it needs a reboot.
Yeah, I still have hope. I think universities are really important institutions.
When I went to Harvard, there were 1,600 people in my class. I think today's class is about the same size. And their online education really has not sort of taken off, right? So I heard Peter Thiel speak at one point in time, and he's like, what great institution do you know that's truly great that hasn't grown in 100 years, right? The incentives in some sense of the alums are it's a bit like a club. Mm-hmm. If you're proud of the elitism of the club, you don't want that many new members, but the fact that the population has grown of the country is so, significantly since certainly I was a student in 1984, and the fact that Harvard recruits people from all over the world, it's really serving a smaller and smaller percentage of the population today. And, some of our most talented and successful entrepreneurs anyway, it's a token of success that they didn't make it through their undergraduate years. They left as a freshman or they didn't attend at all.
For entrepreneurs, yes, but it's still a place.
Very important for research, very important for advancing ideas, and shaping dialogue and the next generation of Supreme Court justices.
Yes.
And, the members of government, politicians. So yes, it's critically important, but it's not doing the job it should be doing.